Hello and welcome to this Cresfest World podcast number 4. Cresfest is a music festival which takes place annually at the start of April in Creswick near Ballarat in country Victoria, and this podcast series features conversations with the intriguing people involved in it. The next 3 podcasts feature something a bit different, and they're linked. 3 months before the first Cresfest in 2022, Creswick was hit by a storm the like of which it had never seen before. More than 200 homes were damaged and many families are still battling to put back together what they had before. This first podcast introduces Alisa and Brian, a young couple who had only just moved to their home a few months before. Families were dramatically affected by the storm. Emergency services did amazing jobs in the intermediate aftermath, and Hepburnshire picked up in the longer term where they left off. As far as the festival was concerned, there were long conversations about whether we should cancel it, but in the end it was decided that some brightness and light might help local people, so on we went. In the second podcast of this 3-part series, you'll hear another couple, Catherine and Mark, talking about the storm and its long-term effects on them. In the third podcast, we look at the composition and performance of a remarkable short opera on the Creswick flood, based on face-to-face interviews between flood survivors and Melbourne University opera students. It was performed recently in Clunes to an audience which included people who'd been directly affected by the storms. I'm recording this 2 years to the day, January the 5th, since the storms hit Creswick, and these podcasts are dedicated specifically to all those who were affected by them. Let's hear now from Brian, who was assistant manager on duty in a big hotel in the edge of Creswick when the storm hit, and Alisa, who was at their home a kilometre away.
The Creswick storm on the 5th of January was just a blip on the news. Oh, yep, this happened. But for the people like my neighbours who have had to, their roof collapsed and they had to go and live in a whole other location for months, nearly a year, this was huge. This is so traumatic and it was an upheaval of their life.
It was a really hot day.
Yeah.
So it was not, it wasn't expected at all that there would be that kind of, we often have hot days where you get a storm, but it wasn't expected that there would be that kind of level of disaster. And it started with really epic lightning, which I think hit a tree just at the bottom of our property, which is the loudest lightning I've ever heard. And it lit up the whole house and it was just so wild. And then the hail came down, which was more hail than I've ever seen before. It looked like it had completely snowed everywhere. And part of the problem with damage was that the hail blocked all of the gutters. It was just so much hail. We had probably at the bottom of the garden, I guess because it had washed down, there was more, but half a metre of hail deep.
Yeah.
And then the rain came, which washed a lot of the hail down the hill as well. But because the hail had blocked gutters and there was, I can't remember how much rain. I think it was 150 mils of rain in less than an hour or something like that. So it was a lot of water that meant we just had waterfalls because we're on a hill running down either side of the house, under the house. I looked out and I wondered if the car would float away because the water was coming up so kind of close, and the car's parked on a hill. So I was like, I wonder if that's a thing that happens. And I guess if it does, I just leave it. I don't know. And then, of course, what we sort of, I guess, didn't think of, I was sort of racing around taking photos and videos because I was like, wow, what a wild kind of nature thing, how crazy, and thinking it was pretty fun is the wrong word in retrospect, but interesting and kind of exciting. And then I realized that because the gutters had all been blocked by the hail and the water had nowhere to go, it was starting to come through the ceiling, and it came through. We have you can sort of see it there. We have a panelled ceiling, and so every crack basically just had water coming through it and through the chimney, and it was just then trying to lay towels down and sort of being like, oh. And Brian called me, I think at the beginning, and was like, oh, do you want to come up to the hotel and just, stay there like for a bit? And I was like, oh no, I'm going to stay here with the cat and the dog. And also, I don't think I would have been able to get there. It's only, not even a kilometre up the road, I don't think, but I don't think I would have been able to physically get there. The power went out very early, and I don't think we had power for a few days. Our road was blocked off by multiple trees falling, and many trees came down. But because the storm was so loud, I didn't hear the trees, which was probably quite a good thing, because I think that would have been really terrifying.
Then the water had now come through the first floor, so it's gone through 4 tiers, and rainwater started coming down onto the desk, which is full of electrical equipment, computers and all that type of thing. So we're moving those things out of the way. We're putting down towels, and over the comms, I was like, oh, we're going to need a bucket at reception. And by the time that maintenance person had made it to reception, there was literally a waterfall coming down over the desk, and a bucket was just not going to cut it. We needed, we were bringing up wheelie bins to capture the water. The carpet all behind the reception area was now getting really damp, and I remember having quite a weird moment where guests had been coming and complaining about now the roofs in their rooms were starting to collapse. The plaster from the water damage was so bad that the panels in the roof were starting to drop down onto the bed. And so the advice I was giving was, well, move your valuables and things into the bathroom, and then need you to come downstairs because it's obviously it's not safe. And everybody was gathering in the bar area, and I realized I don't have enough rooms, and the calls kept coming through. But one lady approached the desk, and I was expecting another request for, their rooms got water damage, and they were like, oh, just wondering if it at all possible, we could get some extra towels for the pool and a sofa bed made up in our room. Like the most casual request, while there is a waterfall literally coming down on top of the reception desk, and we're moving computers out of the way, and I'm like, really? Like, are you not aware of what is happening here? But that's the beauty of hotels, I suppose. The resort was evacuated, and really, I think the town being the size that it is, and the emergency services having to deal with homeowners and local businesses, having 250 additional people in the town, is that what we really need right now, and their needs as well. So yes, we did arrange emergency accommodation at another place in another hotel in Ballarat. So yeah, that's how the resort was then assessed. Took about 2 weeks, is what the prediction for being closed. Like the carpets were completely soaked through, so they all needed to be replaced. But then the assessors came through and started peeling back the walls and realizing the extent of the electrical damage.
And then it stopped. Like then it was just over, and it was very, very quiet. And I suspect because a lot of wildlife probably died in the storm as well. But it was summer, so it was still kind of a little bit light outside, and still really warm, which was, yeah, just a really bizarre experience. I think that was the whole experience. Like it was sort of like, oh wow, what a weird thing to happen. And I think even the next day, I think it sort of hit home a bit more, sort of looking at how, I mean, utterly destroyed everything was. We still have trees that have stripped bark and things like that on them because of it. But we're talking every plant just decimated in the garden. And it's amazing how things bounce back. But I think because we didn't have power, we couldn't like make a cup of tea or coffee or anything like that, because we also don't have, like, we're not connected to gas here. And so we couldn't even boil the kettle or do anything kind of normal to start getting our head around. I would say it took almost 12 months to the day. It was and not so much for insurance to approve things. That took a long time, but even just lining up to get things done.
Yeah.
Because of course also we're in a small area, everyone got hit. A lot of the services, are then kind of stretched to replace floors or paint or do any of those things. So it would have been beginning of this year, I guess, that everything got tied up and finished. It probably didn't feel as bad for us. Like I don't know, maybe other people wouldn't have put up with it. We didn't have a kitchen floor for probably 6 or 7 months. And that was fine. But there would be people who are not okay with that. So it just depends on, I guess, your personal, I mean, it sounds awful, but we also lived with moldy curtains for most of last year, which I know a lot of people would be like, oh no, that's very bad for your health, which I'm sure it is. But just a reality of what was kind of easiest. I know that sounds like a cop out in some ways or whatever, but there's also only so much you can kind of do and manage, I think, in your bandwidth as well of how much it overtakes your life. So
Yeah, sure.
So during the storm, I was messaging people to see if people were okay, I suppose. So to a certain extent, we did know that it was like not great. And we have friends who I had been connected with through another artist via Instagram, and we'd never met in person. And I'd sort of messaged and said, oh, is everything okay up your end, like in Creswick North? And they're like, yeah, we're fine, wild, but, actually came out relatively unscathed. And I think we'd been talking through messaging in the few days that followed, and it was probably about maybe a week later, as we'd sort of gathered everything together, the following weekend or something like that, they just turned up with a trailer and started helping us clear stuff for like several hours. And a bunch of other friends had come to help as well. And it was just like so lovely, because we didn't know, apart from, I don't know, do you know someone if you're friends with them on Instagram? It's sort of hard to say, but we're now really good friends, and that was, I like to think we would have become really good friends anyway, but there was something very generous about that act of just showing up. And there was nothing to gain for them, I suppose, apart from maybe a sense of doing something good. It was just a really lovely thing to do, which I think is a small town mentality and something that we see a lot in Creswick as well, in all sorts of situations, which is really lovely. It's what we were looking for in kind of regional and rural living as well, looking for that sense of community, which definitely feels like it. And certainly in the sort of anything that's followed, it's felt like that. We see the same people contributing to community things, whether it's something like Cresfest or the stories at the Creswick Theatre Company, where it was the Found Objects project, or response stuff like the second kind of set of floods or storms that happened, there's always that sense of kind of people sort of looking out for one another, which is nice because I don't think that's guaranteed. When something really bizarre happens in nature, it was one of those days that felt like nature had something weird going on, right? So there was, before the storm, it had been a hot day where you feel like the air's a little bit electric, and then this utterly bizarre storm happens in such a short space of time, and it's so violent and so loud. Like we've got a tin roof, so the noise is just, I can't explain how loud that is really. And in an area that's not normally a very loud area, you know, we're pretty far away from traffic or any other noise. And so when it stopped, it was very odd. Like it was this very, very quiet time. And yeah, I think there probably weren't many birds who were doing very well afterwards and things like that. So there wasn't noise of nature around, which is also odd. Like there was no frogs. There was nothing that you'd hear on a summer's evening. And there was no power. So I couldn't like turn on the TV or, I don't know, really do anything. I was trying to save my phone battery because I didn't know when we'd have power, and turns out we didn't for a while. And so it was getting dark, and I lit some candles because that's all I really had to give light. And I sat down at the piano and I was just playing. I guess I think not necessarily to create noise, but I don't now, the way I play the piano, like I was trained classically and things like that, but the way I play now is much more for myself. And it's a much more kind of, I don't know, improvisational, intuitive process. And I think it's quite meditative and calming, and I can do it for a long time and be easily entertained. So that was just what I did, I suppose. And I recorded a little bit of it, and I had been sharing all of this stuff on Instagram of like just waterfalls through our property. And I was like, oh, I want people to know that I'm okay. So maybe I'll post this and just be like, oh no, it's all good now.
We, as newcomers to the town, we didn't know anybody, and it was quite isolating as fairly social creatures we are. We decided to get involved in the local community so that we could, I guess, make connections. And one of the ways that we did that was through volunteering through Creswick, which was an amazing experience. We had a really great time, and one of the ways, on the Cres Festival, I was helping with door ticket sales at one of the venues in town, Odessa, owned by Chantel and Cam. So I got to make that connection from Cresfest with Chantel and Cam, and they were also really helpful after the storm. But it was a few months later in October when a forecasted weather event was being talked about, that there could be quite significant flooding and that type of thing. And for people in Creswick, this was a little bit triggering because we'd just been through the trauma of the January 5th event, and now they were saying this is going to be pretty bad. And still, city slickers, I was a bit unsure of what to do, and a message came across my device from the notice board on Creswick, and it was from Chantel, and it was a call out to people, and then specifically from the Creswick volunteers that had been part of Cresfest. We had a messenger group, and the messages started popping up in that to say, yep, we're coming down, we're going to help. And so what the request was that we would assist sandbagging people's houses who were at risk or threatened by the floods. So there's a creek that runs through just off past the main street, next to where the motel and the campground is, and that was rising very heavily. So it was actually houses on the main street that were going to be impacted. And it's something about Chantel as well, is that when you get a message from Chantel that says, this is what we're going to do, and we need you to come and help, then you just go, okay, that's what we're going to do. And I got to meet up with some of my fellow Cresfest volunteers on this day. So it started raining the whole day. It was raining, and some of the local businesses had donated sand. There was Hessian sacks, and people were just shoveling. And as the day went on, we sort of created a large amount of sandbags. And then Cam, who's one of the local publicans, he was driving a truck around with all of the sandbags, and then we would go and distribute the sandbags. And it started off actually pretty like good spirits, that there was this, we got to reconnect with the volunteers from Cresfest and a group of friends that we'd made, and but it was pretty tiring work, and it started to flood. And there was a lady's house just a couple of doors down from the main street. It's still on the main street, and her father was in the house, and he was in his late 90s, I think, and she was quite distressed because they couldn't move him, and the water had now come up from their backyard up to, there was 2 or 3 steps into the house, and it was up by the 2nd step. So she was very, very concerned, and Chantel was there directing us, giving orders and getting messages from people who needed help, and sending us off to the next place. And even one of the local dentist, his place was just next door and was getting severely hit as well. So it started to become a little bit more urgent. Going back to the hub or base of operations, which was set up in our local footy ground, and it was in the afternoon that the emergency services started to arrive, and we were there still shoveling, soaked to the bone. And I was watching them get out, and they went inside, and they came out, and they said, oh, there's burgers and there's sandwiches inside, come in and grab something to eat. And I was there thinking, what the are you guys doing? We've been like going at it all day, like from the start of the morning, and we haven't stopped, and you guys have just rocked up now. It's like the late afternoon, and what are you doing? why haven't you been here? Why aren't you helping us? Why aren't you telling us what to do? Why aren't you doing this for us? Why does this town have to do this for ourselves after the storm? You know, we're already still in recovery mode. And I went inside, and they were all eating. All of the emergency services people were eating, and I was getting so angry, and I was getting so mad. And then they let us eat, and then they just sort of patted us on the back, and they said, "All right, that's it. You're done now. You're good." Sorry.
That's all right.
Because I realized what they would. They knew that the night was going to be the worst, and that's why it wasn't safe for volunteers or for people to keep going in the night with the water and the floods. So they knew that we were going to do what we did and keep going, and then they just came in the afternoon and just tapped us out. And so I was I was wrong. They knew what they were doing, that was the safest and the best option, that they could go in through the night. And then that night was terrible. You could hear trees falling down in our yard. Well, you didn't know. You just heard bangs and noises, and you just hoped, it wasn't the shed or the car and you don't know until the morning. You look out, where we are, there's no street lights or anything like that, and you just had to just hope and wait until the morning. So it was a really long night. But after we'd had something to eat, Chantel invited us back to their bar, and they opened they didn't open. Well, they invited us into their bar, and they lit the fire, and we sat around the fire. And I remember we were just soaked through, so wet. And there was hot drinks put on, and then people started playing music, and we maybe had a glass of wine, and we maybe sang through a few songs, and that was the end of the long day, where we actually got to sit together and talk about I remember talking about my story with the storm from the 5th of January, and I think there was something quite healing about that, is because you were in a room with people that knew what you were talking about. Like the Creswick storm on the 5th of January was just a blip on the news. Oh, yep, this happened. But for the people, like my neighbors, who had to, their roof collapsed and they had to go and live in a whole other location for months, nearly a year. This was huge. This is so traumatic and big. It was an upheaval of their life. But you were in a room with people that knew what you were talking about, and they had their stories as well that we got to share. And I think Cameron was playing the piano, and so that was probably that was the best part of that day, was the sharing of the stories. But I would say the whole experience was really good for me, because I hadn't experienced anything like that living in the city.
No.
You know your neighbors, but it feels like in a small country town, you do need to know your neighbors, but it's more than just for a cup of sugar. It's literally, it's survival. I don't regret moving to this town after the storms, and the people, the people absolutely make it. And if the storm happens again, the house, we will rebuild it, or we will fix it, or what needs to happen. But it's the people that make it.
I feel very happy to have met Alisa and Brian through Cresfest, and privileged that they felt able to share their experiences of that year 2022 with such insight, patience and openness. And I hope you, all our listeners, feel like that too. I'd like to thank Alisa for letting me use the recording of her playing the piano, as she describes it, with the candles lit because the power had gone out, to keep a bit of sense of normality about life while water was still running down the inside walls of their home. In the next episode of This Cresfest World, episode 5, you'll hear another Creswick couple, Catherine and Mark, talking about the damage to their home and lives that the storm wrought and how they're rebuilding both. Then, in the third episode, we hear about the amazing short opera put together by Melbourne University opera students based on interviews and conversations organised through the Creswick Lions Club with Creswick locals who had lived through the flood. I'd like to leave you today with a short excerpt from the concert of that flood opera, performed in September 2023 in Clunes Town Hall and recorded live in front of an audience which included Creswick people who had lived through the storms and floods. This is Neil Adam. This has been This Cresfest World. See you next time.